Hi and welcome to the Journalism Salute. I'm Mark Simon. In each episode, we'll talk to or about an interesting person or organization related to journalism. The intent is to show that journalists are not the enemy of the people. Thank you for listening. On today's show, our guest is Darragh Worland. Darragh is the Vice President of Creative Services for the News Literacy Project. The News Literacy Project is about making people better news consumers. She'll explain further. Darragh has been with this group for nearly 10 years and has worked in a variety of roles before taking her current position. She has previously worked as a journalist and producer in a number of places, including one of my favorite networks, New York One News. By the way, she also hosts a podcast that we'll discuss shortly. Darragh, welcome. Let's start by explaining what the group does, and we'll start broadly and kind of work to things that are more specific. How does the News Literacy Project help people be better news consumers?
The News Literacy Project is a non-partisan national education nonprofit, and we provide programs and resources to equip educators with the skills needed to help their students be smart, active consumers of news and information and more engaged participants in a democracy. And we do this through several pathways. And recently we expanded our mission to also bring news literacy abilities to the general public. So we have a suite of programs and services and resources that we offer to educators, and then we also have a suite of the same that we offer to the general public. Checkology is probably the primary means by which we reach students. It's a browser-based e-learning platform that helps students develop news literacy, knowledge, skills, and habits of mind. We also have the SIFT, which is a weekly newsletter with timely examples of misinformation, social media trends, and issues around press freedom. And it includes discussion prompts and activities for the classroom. We offer professional development. We have a resource library on our website with downloadable lessons and activities and infographics, quizzes, and training materials. And then we also do an annual event called National News Literacy Week, which we launched last year. And that's the last week of January. And that is aimed at the general public and educators to help increase awareness around news literacy and its value. And then for the public, we also just recently launched a version of Checkology that's public facing. It's kind of a scaled down version of what we offer educators and students. And then we also recently launched our Get Smart About News newsletter, which is similar to and based on the SIFT, but without the educator prompts. We have a mobile app called Informable. It kind of offers game-like opportunities for people to practice news literacy skills, things like separating news from opinion, fact from opinion. You know, is this an ad or not? Is this evidence or not? Then we also have a podcast, which I host, which is called Is That a Fact? And we launched that in September. So a lot of new initiatives for the general public, obviously, that we just recently launched because this is a new part of our mission.
So in the end, this is very much a teaching group, and we've had a couple of teaching groups that we've talked to here. And I guess the question would be, what do people need to learn? What are the basic issues that people are having in consuming news right now?
Yeah, well, I'd say, social media is definitely at the heart of a lot of the issues we're seeing around, challenges to people's ability to determine the credibility of information. That's really at the heart of it. And, certainly before social media and the internet, evaluating the credibility of a news report was always important. But now with the disaggregation of news and information that you see on social media, where things are essentially being taken away from their original source, put in your news feed and presented alongside, memes and rumors and conspiracy theories, it's increasingly difficult to be able to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff. And the other thing that's happening is people are really challenged when it comes to separating opinion from fact. And that's something I think that really started with 24-hour news, where the two are often very blended and not clearly labeled or identified. Opinion is, people are sharing their opinions. You've got, so-called talking head experts who are sharing their opinions on what might look otherwise like a news report with an anchor moderating to maybe the untrained eye, for example. So I would say those are the two main issues. And then those are the two main issues.
Would you say that on top of that, certainly the psychology of people is a big part of this, that people now are very rushed people are very impatient, and people might not be as quick or know to check when they should be checking.
Yeah, well, I mean, we live in the most complex information environment in human history. So, you got to give people a little bit of leeway, and understand the fact that we're all facing this fire hose of information coming at us that is incredibly difficult to sift through. And we have our smartphones on us at all times. You might be getting alerts from news organizations repeatedly throughout the day. You're getting emails, you're getting texts, you're getting phone calls. So that inundation obviously leads to a lot of anxiety, and we make snap judgments often based on headlines, and I think it's understandable. I think all of us are facing this challenge, and then you combine that with certain sort of psychological tendencies that have been well researched, things like confirmation bias, for example. So we all have this tendency, and it doesn't really diminish with your degree of education. We all have this tendency to lean into information that confirms our beliefs and to pull away from information that contradicts our beliefs. And so, in social media, the algorithms are ultimately designed to further entrench those, right? Because everything that we click on becomes another force multiplier of what is going to be presented to us next. And then we become further and further sort of entrenched in our belief systems. And so to work against that and to be conscious of what we're consuming on a daily basis and what we're believing and what we're leaning into takes work. It takes a lot of work.
And the other thing is certainly that now the people that make the news have a direct pipeline to the people who consume it through something like Twitter or social media or TikTok. And as you see, for example, even a night or two ago, people are saying things about the president's health, and you don't know what to believe. How does the group, the News Literacy Project, recommend that people deal with such things?
Well, I guess what you're addressing is the fact that there used to be clear gatekeepers of information, right? Which was a good thing, but also had some drawbacks. So that, the gatekeepers were professional journalists who worked on large teams with editors who were vetting information and fact checking and ensuring that the information that they were sharing through, limited avenues such as television or print or radio was accurate. Whereas today, you or I or anybody with any different kind of agenda can share their views or doctor an image or even create what's called like a cheap fake video and share it on social media and gain traction, right? So what's happened is we are all gatekeepers ultimately, and we all have different degrees of ability to judge the credibility of what we're sharing. And the other thing is, it's not just who's posting this stuff, it's also who's sharing it, right? So like, I may not even be creating information and disseminating it, but every time I share information, I'm ultimately further disseminating it. I'm becoming, sort of like an avenue of syndication for rumors and propaganda, often unwittingly. So so I guess the question was, how do we deal with this? Well, I mean, I think it's really important to stop and think. And it's so easy to hit the like button or the share button, but that's really currency on social media. And what you're doing is amplifying information every time you do that. And so what'll often happen, okay, so like one of the rumors circulating about Trump is he was, I think it was, he was coming off of Air Force One or the helicopter when he was landing at Walter Reed. And there was a rumor that he had some oxygen that was being fed to him, So you may be inclined to believe that and think, well, he's sicker than he's letting on. And there may be some political motivation behind your desire to lean into that information. And you probably are going to be inclined to share it, to like it, which is going to amplify it, even though you're not sharing it without verifying it. And you may think, what's the harm? What's the harm? Well, the harm is, it's just as much as I think we all know in our real lives, like IRL, that there is harm caused by rumor, there's harm caused by gossip, there's harm caused by spreading misinformation about an individual. And I think we're less inclined to really understand the harm that is done to ultimately people's thinking and the actions that they will take based on that misinformation. So I would say stop, especially if you're having a strong feeling about something, whether it's excitement or amazement or anger or frustration. Stop and think and double check. And if something is not verified, it might mean it's true and it hasn't been verified yet. That's fine. Just wait before you share it, and check as many credible sources as you can.
This jibes with what you wrote about in a September 30th piece in the New York Daily News. In fact, you gave a series of tips. The first one was pause to consider your emotional response to the information. A particularly strong reaction, fear, anger, laughter, revulsion, amazement, should prompt you to look closer. So it's essentially, we used to say think before you speak. Now it's essentially think before you tweet and think before you react. Is there something, maybe this gets a little more personal, but is there something that particularly, as they would say, like grinds your gears, that when you see it as a piece of misinformation or a type of thing that happens in the misinformation world that you are particularly passionate about?
We've been doing a lot of work around conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking lately, because we're working on a lesson for Czechology that will focus specifically on that. And we're deliberately calling it conspiratorial thinking as opposed to conspiracy theories, because we want to put the emphasis on the kind of thinking that leads one down the path to believe a conspiracy theory. And, I don't know the statistics around this, but it definitely seems that conspiracy theories are gaining a lot more traction today. And I think it has to do with a few factors, particularly, the falling trust in news media, and, social media is certainly contributing to the ability for people with outlandish theories to gather together in groups and then to contribute and build on conspiracy theories. So I would say, that's something that when you spend a lot of time, particularly looking on message boards and social media groups, at what people are sharing and what they're willing to believe without double checking or without credible evidence, it's very concerning and incredibly damaging.
And how do you react to when you see the latest things that come out from something like QAnon?
Yeah, QAnon is really perplexing. And it's really sort of like the grand poobah of all conspiracy theories, right? I mean, it's got everything you could really dream of in a conspiracy theory. If you're somebody who's inclined toward conspiratorial thinking, I think what concerns me most about QAnon is that it's cult-like, right? It has almost like a cult-like leader who's this invisible figure. Nobody knows who QAnon is, who's making these Q drops. We don't know if it's multiple people. There's certainly no way to know whether it's a credible source, but I think there's plenty of indications that it's not credible, using a lot of the sort of disinformation playbook, methods and language.
And yet people buy in very easily.
Yeah, I mean, I think, QAnon is appealing because there's also growing mistrust of, government institutions, right? And so QAnon is ultimately this idea that there is a deep state, and that in particular Trump is in the White House in Washington working to uproot the deep state. I guess, to use his language, drain the swamp, although not to say that Trump is a proponent of QAnon, although he has shared tweets about QAnon. And there are a growing number of members of Congress and former members of Congress who are QAnon adherents. And so that's really disturbing as well. And there's been so much reporting by really credible news organizations, deep investigative work into QAnon that's provided plenty of evidence that it is not credible and it's so outlandish. And yeah, I find it really disturbing that people are willing to believe it. And the problem is with conspiracy theories is that once somebody has bought into it, and increasingly buys into it, there's really no reaching them, because logic doesn't really work in contradicting a conspiracy theory, because it's the way we sort of look at it, it's almost like critical thinking run wild. And so, you know, the more critical thinking you apply to it, the more an adherent could sort of just continue to throw ridiculous arguments that are, you just end up in sort of a downward spiral. So that's why I think it's really important to address it before people tend to lean into it, right? So if we understand the psychological sort of weaknesses that lead us to want to believe in a conspiracy theory before we go down that path, we can stop ourselves before we get there, right? So I think that's why it's really important to teach students before they've really become deeply entrenched.
Yep, it's essentially show them your daily news article and just put it like right in front of their faces and say, read this before you do anything.
Yeah, I mean, I wish it were that simple, but
Yep.
you know, I mean, that's why we have Checkology, right?
Yep.
With multiple lessons and tools and exercises and activities, because it really is it requires an entire curriculum of lessons and resources to really build one's news literacy abilities.
How long does it take to go through something like that, as if I was to sign up for it, today?
Well, Checkology is designed to be used in many different ways, right? Like, so it's not like a curriculum that you go through sequentially. And, you know, there are 13 lessons on the platform right now, but educators can explore them in whatever order they like. They can do one lesson, they can do multiple lessons. So each lesson takes about, 45 minutes. Sometimes it's a class period, sometimes they'll extend it over 2 class periods. So, we've had educators who have used it in the classroom once a week for an entire school year, and actually managed to kind of spread it out that way. And then we've had educators who have done more concentrated, used it in a more concentrated way. So, there's not really one, answer to that question.
I want to segue over to, I asked you about an issue that particularly grinds your gears. I have 2 that particularly get to mind. One is that I've kind of view everything with this as a multifaceted issue. There's the issue of separating the truth from the fiction, and then there's the other separating what I would call hype from reality. I'll use an example just to educate the audience. At the Democratic National Convention, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez was part of the procedural motion nominating Bernie Sanders for president. And NBC News tweeted, in one of the shortest speeches of the DNC, Representative Ocasio-Cortez did not endorse Joe Biden. However, as she pointed out, that was extraordinarily misleading, given that she had previously endorsed Biden and her speech was of similar length to other nominating speeches. In other words, NBC was trying to make news out of something that really was not news. So how do you go about teaching people to understand how to deal with clickbait like that?
Oof, I think a lot of assumptions are being made in the interpretation of what happened, right? So NBC did tweet out immediately that AOC had not endorsed Biden and was endorsing Sanders instead. I can't remember the exact language. For me, having worked in the news business, it's pretty easy for me to imagine a fairly junior staff member being having the keys to the
Yep.
NBC Twitter, right? And probably not understanding the ins and outs of the Democratic convention, probably hasn't been on the convention circuit for 10 years, like a more experienced political reporter, and had not read the information that was released by the convention to journalists ahead of time, making it clear that this is a formality and it is a requirement of the convention, that every nominee who receives enough votes needs to have an official nomination and be part of the roll call, and that AOC was participating in that process, particularly herself as a supporter of more progressive Democratic policies. She explained that herself, right, in a tweet. So that's the other thing that's kind of interesting about our social media environment, that a mistake I don't know, maybe it was designed to be clickbait. My guess is that it was more likely a mistake. So it was an example of misinformation. And NBC, by the way, deleted the tweet and apologized for it, right? Which is what a credible news organization does when they inadvertently spread misinformation. So it is an example of misinformation, not disinformation. Very unlikely that it was deliberately designed to mislead the public. And then AOC, I don't know if it was in real time, but probably pretty soon after, was able to correct the record. She has a lot of followers, so that was able to go viral. And actually, the first I heard of it myself was AOC's correction. So, and I actually think most people probably walked away. If anyone knew about what had happened, they probably remembered the correction of the record, because so many news organizations covered this because of the whole flurry and controversy. I mean, AOC was really mad about it, and she essentially accused NBC of deliberately falsely spreading misinformation. But that itself might even be some hype.
Right. I've worked previously in places where junior staffers have had access, and I guess let's address it from that angle. I understand that she's able to correct it, lots of things are able to happen, but essentially the junior staffer is adding to the fire hose and just making things even more difficult for the person that's consuming the information. And I guess something like your kind of group, how do you suggest that people, when they see something like that, is it just, again, back to your, consider your emotional response?
Absolutely. And that's another great point, is that we all need to understand that we're particularly in breaking news environments, we need to understand as news consumers that the truth is provisional, in the sense that particularly, let's imagine that there's like a major event like an earthquake, right? And obviously the information coming out from the ground is going to evolve over time. The number of people injured, the cost of the damage done, how soon we knew about the earthquake, what it was like to experience on the ground. So you have to have this understanding that information and the truth is provisional and is subject to change as more context and information becomes available. That's something that reporters know. Reporters understand that the news gathering process is a painstaking one. And I think, most journalists at credible news organizations are doing everything they can to make sure that they're not spreading misinformation, that they're getting their facts right. But we operate in such an intensely competitive environment. I say we as a former journalist, I'm going back into my journalist head, but and the pressures are intense to get information out quickly. And that's where I think a lot of the mistakes happen. And in that, so I didn't work in a news environment with social media, because I left news when social media really hit prominence. I was already moving towards like news literacy education. But it was already hard enough in a 24-hour news environment where you're essentially trying to fill airtime at a 24-hour news organization like New York One, or I was also working at Fox News for a period of time. And that's where I think a lot of the mistakes come up. I'm not the world's biggest fan of this 24-hour news environment. I tend to prefer to digest my news in longer form, more thoughtful packaging.
Most people don't.
Well, I'm a former journalist.
Yep,
so
me too. I'm right there with you.
Yeah, I come from a different perspective, but I also like to be in the know, just like anybody else. I want to know what's going on, and I want to be, I have that tendency too on social media to want to be the first to announce something. Like if you hear that RBG died, you want to be the first to announce it on your social media feed or whatever. But today though, I've learned enough to really kind of hold myself back from those instincts, just because I do understand that the truth is provisional in these situations.
And it's something we certainly need to make more people aware of. And another aspect of this In my professional field, I work with statistics on a daily basis, and I have seen statistics used for good. I have seen statistics used for bad. In the sports arena, a number of things are currently going on, including one where the big leagues are reporting coronavirus statistics and not necessarily presenting the full picture of information. Your group, the News Literacy Project, has a partnership with SAS to essentially address this. And I'm curious if you could share with us more about that.
We are partnering with SAS Analytics, which is a data company that provides software and analysis to large corporations to help them with, interpreting data and statistics. And we teamed up with them because data literacy is obviously a really important element in news literacy, increasingly so. I think COVID is a great example that you brought up, because we're all trying to be armchair statisticians and armchair epidemiologists and interpreting all this information and numbers coming at us. What does it mean? What's the mortality rate versus the death rate? So when we teamed up with SAS, we were really excited because they are experts in this area and can provide that intellectual property and subject matter expertise that we don't necessarily have on staff. And so far we've done a series of blog posts with them focused on understanding COVID data. And they've actually been really successful. I think looking at our website data, we've actually seen a lot of people searching terms around COVID data, and that's what's bringing them to our website. And then, happy to know that people who are searching for credible information about COVID statistics are landing there. And then more recently, as part of a PSA campaign that we're doing to educate the public about election and voting misinformation, we teamed up with SAS again to create a quiz. It's just 5 questions that are designed to test the user's ability to evaluate statistics, data, bar charts, graphs, etc. And then we did a series of, I think it's 8 blog posts about interpreting data so that people can test their knowledge and then gain more knowledge, and then they can take the test again and see if their score has improved. So, we also, as just as important, data interpretation is really important when you're facing something like a global pandemic, but it's also incredibly important when it comes to understanding statistics that are coming out around the election. They may not be directly related to election polls, but there's a lot of facts and statistics that we all need to be able to interpret when we're weighing who we're going to cast our ballot for.
And certainly it's the same as on the news side. The fire hose just comes at you and it just spits out so much that you have to try and sift through it. I find it challenging even for myself.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I'm no expert in statistics either. And it sounds to me like you're much more expert in that area than I am. But yeah, I find it really helpful to be able to break it down and gain a little bit more knowledge. And at the very least, what it can do is stop me, just like, other areas on social media. It can stop me from sharing what looks like a credible chart and potentially inadvertently sharing misinformation. One thing we found is that the one question people do tend to get wrong the most is the final question, which has to do with interpreting data that's shared in a social media post and that looks credible but isn't, which is concerning, right? Because that's how a lot of people are coming across their information. Most people are absorbing their news and information on social media today.
Darragh Worland, a couple of more questions just to wrap this up. I mentioned at the start that you have a podcast. I have listened to the first 3 parts of that. It's called Is That a Fact? It's a 10-part series. Your most recent guest was Maria Ressa, the CEO and executive editor of Rappler, an online news website in the Philippines that you might have heard about. There's a documentary being made about her situation. She has been arrested for cyber libel. Tell us about the podcast and how people can find it.
Sure. Well, at the News Literacy Project, we've been kicking around the idea of creating a podcast for years. It's kind of been blue sky idea of ours for a while. And then particularly as we expanded our mission to help the general public become more news literate, it started to seem more urgent that we reach the public through a podcast. And so we launched season 1 in September, and we opted to do the podcast in seasons so that we could just sort of experiment with formats and see what our audience responds to. And I imagine a lot of people listening are journalists and educators, but we're also looking to help bring news literacy skills and abilities to a general public that might not otherwise be encountering this. They might not be signing up for Checkology and might be podcast listeners. So our first season, we're looking at the impact of misinformation on democracy. If you are somebody who follows, the news a lot, you've probably seen a lot of stories about, the end of American democracy, and it's usually from a political lens. But when we look at the threats that we're facing in American democracy today, it seems like the central cause is really misinformation. And so we wanted to take each episode and look at a specific threat caused by our information landscape, and particularly misinformation that is threatening democracy. And so, like you mentioned, we're 4 episodes in at this point. Our first guest was Brendan Nyhan, who's a government professor at Dartmouth, and he's the co-founder of a group called the Bright Line Watch, which monitors democracy and surveys political scientists on, how they're feeling about the state of democracy. We also talked to Michael Luo, who's editor at NewYorker.com, about a piece he wrote on the role of journalism in democracy for a series that the New Yorker is doing on democracy and American democracy, and is it the end of it? And then, as you mentioned, we also spoke to Maria Ressa about threats to press freedom. She lives in the Philippines, which is, on paper a democracy, but under President Duterte, press freedom has been incredibly challenged, and she in particular has just been the subject of repeated verbal attacks, and she was arrested, and she's she's subject to so many different intimidation tactics by the Duterte government, and she's really bravely continuing to do the work of a journalist. The way she sees it is she is just doing what she signed up to do as a journalist and reporting the facts, and really bringing to light a lot of the cruelty and violence in his regime.
I would say that the biggest thing that I got from that one was how inspiring she can be with what she's trying to do. Segueing off of inspiring, we go to our pay forward to close it out. What tips do you have for aspiring journalists and journalism consumers?
Well, I'd say for aspiring journalists, I really admire anyone going into journalism today, because so much is required of journalists, more so than I think ever before. And, they have to, in many cases, they have to understand multimedia. They have to be able to manage social media while also remaining neutral and impartial. They're confronted with a political situation that's incredibly challenging to cover as a journalist, and breaking news constantly. And I think it's got to be an incredibly exhausting time to be a journalist. And so I think the admiration that we should feel for journalists should be much greater than it is. And I think journalists have to deal with an incredible onslaught of criticism. What I would say is make sure that you're working for a news organization, that the news organizations you choose to work for and to lend your name to, make sure that they have really rigorous standards and practices and that they adhere to them. I'll give an example. When I was just starting out after grad school as a journalist and, trying to piece together enough work to make a living in New York City, I was working freelance for New York One before I became full-time, and freelance for FoxNews.com. And it was really striking to me at the time, the difference in how the news organizations would treat breaking news. So, at the time, Osama bin Laden was, it seems like ancient history at this point, but Osama bin Laden was releasing videos that would make it into the hands of news organizations. New York One always waited before they aired the video of Osama bin Laden. They waited for it to be verified by the US government, by credible sources. Whereas Fox would air it and would say it has not been verified. And that was striking to me as a young journalist, and it helped me make choices about where I wanted to be lending my name and my efforts and developing my journalism chops. So that would be my primary advice.
All right, and last question, is there a journalism organization other than yours that you would like to salute?
Well, I mean, you've already mentioned Maria Ressa and Rappler, and I would definitely salute her and her entire team, because they are continuing to report the truth in an environment where truth is being assaulted on a daily basis and where their lives and their freedom are at risk. I think that is heroic. It's unusual and incredibly brave. And she was really shy when I interviewed her about sort of accepting some of those labels. But I think they 100% apply to her. And I think it's really people like her who have that humility, who are willing to do that kind of work. Who she really, it's a calling for her. But the other news organization that I would give a shout out to is Snopes. I think these fact-checking sites are doing incredibly important work, again, in an environment where there's so much information to be fact-checking on a daily basis. And Snopes actually released a statement in March saying that it had to scale back on its fact-checking activities and special projects in the face of the overwhelming amount of misinformation about COVID, to care for their staff, because their staff were at home. Their staff were facing, the stress and pressures of being in quarantine, socially distancing, having families at home, who, kids who aren't in school. And I just thought that was really human. And what they ended up doing was providing links on their site, in addition to the work that they did continue to do, to credible sources of information about COVID. So, I think Snopes and other fact-checking sites like PolitiFact, factcheck.org really deserve our support, and people should use them on a regular basis.
Darragh Worland, the two biggest takeaways I've gotten from talking to you: think and pay attention are definitely the most important. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mark. Great to be here.
The News Literacy Project was founded by Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Alan Miller in 2008. In a Q&A with the Washington Post, Alan explained the origin of the project coming from a talk he gave about why his work mattered to his daughter's 6th grade classmates. He received 175 handwritten thank you notes. There doesn't seem to be much appreciation for journalists these days, but we thank anyone taking the steps to make sure that people are better news consumers. For more information on the News Literacy Project, go to their website, newslit.org. In addition to what Darragh mentioned, I recommend clicking on the link called Sanitize What You Share. It offers 4 quick steps to stop the spread of misinformation. The Journalism Salute is dedicated to the memory of Dr. Robert Cole. Dr. Cole, a journalism professor at Trenton State College, the College of New Jersey, inspired hundreds of future journalists in his more than 30 years as a teacher. There are dozens of great quotes about Dr. Cole from his students. I like this one from his NJ.com obituary from Ray Hennessy. Most professors just make sure you're prepared when you leave college. Bob Cole followed you as if your entire career were a course he was still teaching. Thank you for listening to the Journalism Salute. If you're interested in following along with us, follow us on Twitter at journalismsalute, SALUT. There are more episodes to come. Thank you for tuning in.